Ploidy is a term that gets used a lot when we start to talk about life cycles, and it's definitely a term that comes up when we talk about cell division, whether it is mitosis or whether we're actually looking at meiosis. So we definitely want to understand what that term ploidy means. When we use that term, we're talking about the number of chromosome sets, or another way to say it is the number of copies of each unique chromosome that an organism has. Now, when I say unique chromosomes would be different chromosomes, and unique chromosomes, they're different because these are going to contain different genes. They have different genes. They actually look quite different from each other, and by look quite different, this means that they're going to maybe be different lengths. They might have their centromeres in different locations. They might have the centromeres kind of off center, so they may not be right there in the center of the two arms of the chromosome. So each organism has a unique chromosome number, and we refer to that as the N number. So the N number is going to tell us basically how many different chromosomes do we have inside of an organism. And if we're talking about humans, the N number is 23. So if we're looking at a cell, we have 23 different chromosomes. They look different. They contain different genes on them. When we talk about ploidy, we're saying how many of each one of those unique chromosomes do they happen to have? And we use different terms to refer to the ploidy depending on how many copies are actually present. So if we look at different types of ploidy, we can have one copy of everything. That is what we call haploid. And we can also have two copies of everything, and that's what we call diploid, because di means two. Now, the difference between this is the number of chromosomes that we actually have, but we do have different cell types that tend to exhibit these two different types of ploidy. When we're talking about haploid cells, at least in the case of animals, this tends to be what we have in the gametes, or in other words, in the reproductive cells. That would be egg and sperm that we're looking at there. So they are going to be haploid or have one copy of everything. And if we're talking about diploid cells, this tends to be what we have in the somatic cells. So for humans, our somatic cells, which is everything that's not egg and sperm, skin, hair, liver cells, they're all going to have two copies of each chromosome. Now, if we know the N number of an organism, so if we know, for example, that an organism has 10 unique chromosomes, we can figure out how many chromosomes would be in the diploid version. Because diploid, it is 2N, so if we know that the haploid number is 10, we can just take that and say 2 times 10, plug that in for our N number right there, and then we can say, okay, a diploid cell from that organism is actually going to have 20 chromosomes inside of it. Another way to talk about it is to look at higher ploidies. We can have tetraploids, we can have hexaploids, there's octaploids, decaploids. So all of these, this is the number of sets of each chromosome, each unique chromosome that an organism has. And when we're talking about these, this tends to be something that we find in plants, and we call these conditions polyploids. Polyploids is really anything over 2, so 3 or more copies of chromosomes we would consider polyploids, and plants quite commonly are polyploid organisms.